Good evening, Zimbabweans and friends of Zimbabwe, wherever you are. This is Dr. Noah Manyika of the Build Zimbabwe Alliance. And as I'm sure you know, at this time every Wednesday, we get together to discuss some serious issues concerning the future of our country. Before I begin, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Please, if you can hear me, can you indicate? Can you just let me know that the sound is clear before I proceed? Yeah, one of the challenges is that I'm actually on the road, and where I am, the Wi-Fi service is not very good. So we are going to go through this a little faster than normal. All right, it's good. I can see that people can hear me from wherever they are. So again, we are going to do this a bit faster, just so that we don't get interrupted because of the state of the Wi-Fi where I am. It's a little bit challenging to say the least. But so I will just give this another 30 seconds so people can sign in and we can begin our discussion. Maybe as people come in, I would just kind of refer to some of the things that we have talked about in the past 3 weeks before we get into the subject that we are going to be discussing today. Last week, I was talking about the importance of us making sure that whatever leadership we elect is the kind of leadership that just doesn't excite us about change, but the kind of leadership that can actually deliver on the change that it promises. And I made reference last week to the fact that this, change has come to many African countries. There are African countries that have changed leaders before. We're not the first ones to actually come to this point. But unfortunately, if you look at the post-colonial history of Africa, you will find that we keep repeating the same mistakes, even mistakes that others have made. It's I remember one of the things that never used to embarrass me actually immensely was the attitude of Zimbabweans towards the country of Zambia. We used to make fun of Zambia. We used to make fun of their currency, and there's nothing more humiliating than coming into Zambia and finding that these people are managing their currency well. They are transacting things in kwacha, and things are working. And here we are, as arrogant as we were at independence, thinking we would never sink to that level, actually importing stuff now from Zambia. I was talking to someone recently, and they were talking about all the hair stuff, all the hair products that are coming from up north. And it's really important, as I said last week, for us to learn from history. If we don't learn from history, we do so at our own peril. If we actually don't pay attention to the mistakes that others have made, then we are actually going to be in trouble ourselves. So anyway, today, what I want to talk about is, in order for us to win the war on poverty, there are some seriously conflicting interests that we must reconcile. And for me, and for the Build Zimbabwe Alliance, this is really about the war on poverty. Think about this. As I've said before, over 70% of Zimbabweans live under the poverty datum line. That's not a number that we've just plucked from somewhere. Priska Mfumira, the Minister of Social Welfare under Robert Mugabe, actually said that 2 years ago, confirmed that number. We have 70% of our people living under the poverty datum line. And I've also said this before. There are a lot of people who say, well, you know what, we must restore Zimbabwe to the state that it was when it was the breadbasket of Southern Africa, And I like pointing out that, yeah, even when we were the breadbasket of Southern Africa, people who were living in the rural communities, and these were the majority of our people, were still living in abject poverty. So one of the things that we must be very, very careful of is actually thinking that we can build a great country whilst leaving the majority of our people behind. And, unfortunately, we've had experiences in the past where people come in with the kind of doctrine and worldview that is actually defunct, like communism and so on. And they talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat and just how much they are, this is about the people, when it's in fact really not about the people. I lived in a communist country before, and I saw just how elitist some of the leadership of the communist parties were, and just how much they actually enjoyed the benefits of government and at the expense of the people. So this is not what we're talking about. We must ask ourselves this question: can we build a truly equitable society? And when we say equitable, we're talking about equitable in terms of opportunity. You cannot force someone to take advantage of opportunities that are there. And a lot of times, I think some of these ideologies, that's the mistake that they made. You have to create opportunities for everybody, but you can't force everybody to take advantages of the opportunities that are there. So for us, this is really about the war on poverty. And if anyone is going to lead this country, they must understand that there are some very seriously conflicting interests that they have to reconcile. And so one of the interests, for instance, is the interest of the common man versus the interests of big business. And, I really like to qualify these statements. I like to really make people understand that we are pro-business. In our ideology, we truly believe that businesses are the ones that create jobs. It's not necessarily government. We believe that there should be an incredibly fair environment for people who come and invest to make money, legally and within reason. Obviously, we believe all that. So it's important for me to make this statement. Even ahead of me saying what I'm about to say, that the interests of the common man and the interests of big business are not necessarily always congruent. They are not always necessarily reconcilable. And since November, one of the interesting things that we have experienced in Zimbabwe is the pressure, particularly coming from the business community, for people to accept that what happened in November is the change that we have all been waiting for. And I've had many conversations actually with business people. And one of the things that I found out is that they just want to be able to do business. That's it. This whole issue of injustice and all of that, is really not a priority for them. That's one of the reasons why you're finding that the current government, whenever it travels, it takes all these delegations of business people and so on, and all of a sudden, these people are darlings of the business community. We must never forget. We must never be so naive to forget that big businesses all over the world do businesses in some of the most dysfunctional countries, and that in fact there are serious investments that big businesses make in countries where their governments will tell you these countries have serious human rights records. So I never cease to be amazed sometimes by the hypocrisy that we see when dealing with states like China. If you go to China today, you're going to find almost every big business from the West actually with offices there and doing serious business in China. That's just a reality. So let me make this clear. We must never assume that the interest of big business is for justice in any country. We must never assume that. And it's wonderful to have some that are very civic-minded and that would support the efforts to actually get redress for people who are being exploited. But I can assure you, it's not many that do that. It would be amusing if it were not tragic some of the experiences that I personally have had with some business people from Zimbabwe who, prior to November, we were friends, we were talking about the future of our country, and you would think that we were on the same page. And come November, the shift was actually dramatic, because what they saw, and this is something that we have heard being said over and over again, that ED is the only one who can actually bring stability to our country so that people can do business. Now, remember, this has nothing to do with the 70% of our people who are living in abject poverty. Nothing. This has everything to do with people actually wishing to have an environment where they can really, really improve their bottom line. So in order to lead in a way which actually directly addresses the war on poverty, somehow you have to find a way of reconciling the interests of business and the interests of the common man. And that's not easy to do. And this is the reason why one of the things that we are doing, even with these discussions on Wednesday, we are really interested in serious discussions and not just name calling. We're not interested in people just coming in. Even when it comes to addressing questions, I really want to engage with people who really want to give this serious thought. We need to give this serious thought ahead of these elections. And as you know, this is a campaign, so nobody is compelled or forced to vote for anyone. People should vote for the people of their choice. But I really believe that we would be doing ourselves a serious disfavor if we didn't address some of these things very, very directly. Because whether you like it or not, leaving a huge chunk of Zimbabweans behind actually catches up with you. It will affect you. You just ask the people who are in the diaspora today, the people who actually have to take care of 3-4 families, the family that they have overseas and the families back home, because those people cannot take care of themselves. And, the people who have to fork out so much money for their relatives back home because these people cannot actually meet their own medical needs. So it does matter how many people are left behind, in any development process. And as far as I'm concerned, I think it's critical for us, all Zimbabweans, and this is not just us as Build Zimbabwe, every Zimbabwean, to give this some serious thought. Elect people who are going to be able to balance the conflicting interests of these two groups of people. Well, there are other interest groups as well. So how do you think about the vendors? So the interests of vendors versus the interests of formal businesses. How do you reconcile the interests of vendors and the interests of formal businesses? This is something that anyone who comes into leadership is going to have to deal with. There is no doubt that what we have today with vendors everywhere in the streets is the result of the suffering of our people and them looking for ways to survive. There's no doubt about that. There is no doubt that as a result, a lot of the people who are vendors are actually, they set up right in front of a store. And the person who is actually operating these businesses, who has rentals to pay, is competing with the guy who is, or the lady who is sitting outside trying to make a living. And, as a result, obviously there is disruption of business and so on and so forth. So how do you deal with the conflicting interests of the vendors and formal businesses? Because you've got to deal with that. You've got to address these situations, and find a solution. There has to be a solution. Obviously, what we all say is that make the economy work so you can employ vendors in informal employment. Yeah, but you and I realize that that also takes time to actually do. And what you're going to find is that whatever person leads this country is going to be faced with the situation of what do we do with the 90% of our people who are in informal employment. And look, it's not easy to deal with, but how do we deal with it? One of the things that we did this week is to post on our Facebook page our discussion about a common social contract. And we have said there has to be a situation where we can pull Zimbabweans together and we can all agree on what is good for all of us. And it's something that takes a certain type of skill. It requires a certain kind of leadership to bring people together so you can actually agree on what the common good is and how to create what we call the commonwealth. So what is the common good for everybody? What is the common good that would reconcile the interests of the vendor and the formal business? And I can assure you there are no easy answers there, but it's something that requires leadership to bring people together for some of these difficult conversations. And the only way we can build a great country is if we can actually reconcile these interests, these varying interests. So can the interest, for instance, of commuter minibuses in the national commuter system be reconciled? Can you, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, it would be wonderful for us to go back to what we used to have with Zupco, what we used to have with the Harare United Omnibus Company, what we used to have with the Bulawayo United Omnibus Company. Yeah, that's great, for us to be able to have that and to have a commuter system that actually services our people, that runs on time as it used to, and all of that. Okay, but then what do you do with the people who have actually found a way to make a living from providing transportation? What do you do? And I think this is one of the things that is really missing in our political conversations, because we even have right now to proffer the kind of solutions that integrate the interests of these two competing interests. So, you're going to hear me talking, for instance, about rationalizing the transportation system in our country. You're not talking about chucking, banning commuter omnibuses, but how can we make sure that they run efficiently? How can we make sure that they're actually part of an integrated transportation system? They're not outsiders, but they're part of that system and they can benefit from it. And how can we make sure that they can actually build up their businesses and so on? That's a discussion that needs to be had. And unfortunately, a lot of times people get into government and they think all they're going to do is just ban something. Well, we saw what happened when they tried to move commuter omnibuses out of the city center. And what it demonstrated is the kind of problem that I am highlighting even in these talks. We need to really think some of these things through. Not only do we need to think some of these things through, we actually need to make sure we can involve people. Not just the commuter service providers themselves, but the people. We need to actually have a conversation about all of these things and then come up with a solution that actually, makes everybody happy. It's not going to be easy, people, for us to go back to the systems that were there before. In fact, it's just a new day. It's a new day. There are certain realities, there are certain vested interests, there are certain things that have already been created that make it impossible for us to simply go back to where we were before. So there's a rationalization that must happen of our transportation system to make it safer, to make the people who are actually in that business, feel like they're part of a system, but absolutely making sure that it's safer, making sure that it's also profitable for them. Don't forget that a lot of the people who we see today, who are being kind of penalized by, who are being told, now go back to the markets, or, don't park here anymore. We must also remember that there were some politicians who would actually stand up and say, leave them alone. That empowered them to actually do business where they're doing business today. We must also not forget that there was an environment of lawlessness. an environment which has been, for the past 38 years, slowly, just, becoming entrenched in our system. And so it's not just a question of rationalizing some of these businesses. It's also a question of really beginning to reintroduce the rule of law and the respect of law. And, it starts with the politicians. It starts with it starts with the people at the top. Are they committed to actually respecting the law? And then it goes down. And, we must never, at a time such as this, a critical time such as this in our country, never actually stand up and say some things simply to win votes so that we can win the votes of the vendors. We say certain things, then that becomes tricky for us to bring vendors and form our businesses together down the road. We must always think in terms of the common good. What is the common good? We must have the to speak truth, not just to power. I hear this a lot. We are going to speak truth to power. Well, we must actually have the courage to speak truth to different interest groups. So politicians must have the courage to speak truth to vendors. Politicians must have the courage to speak truth to formal business people. We must have the courage to do that. And we must not assume that if we speak truth to some of these interest groups, that they won't vote for us. You know what? One of the things that I say to our team, and I say this forcefully, and I say this all the time, is that we must respect the intellect of the Zimbabwean people. We must respect the intellect of the Zimbabwean people. We must tell them the truth. We must do that. In any case, winning on falsehoods is not something I personally would like. I want to be able to say at the end of the day, my conscience is clear. I told people the truth, and I told people what I could do and what I couldn't do, and then they made their judgment on that basis. So, how do you reconcile the interests of vendors versus the interests of formal businesses? Can the interests of commuter, minibus owners, and the national commuter system even be reconciled? That's a very, very important question to answer. Then there's another group. Can the interests of artisanal miners and big mining companies ever be reconciled? So, and that's not an easy question to deal with. We have over 1 million Zimbabweans who are actually involved in artisanal or informal mining. So what are you going to do? You're going to get into power, and they're just going to say, well, it's illegal for you to mine artisanally. You and I know that it is impossible to do that. So without a conversation with artisanal miners and big miners, all those interest groups, to really figure out what is good for everybody, leaders who are going to come in are going to find themselves actually in trouble, because they will not be able to carry these different interest groups forward, even as they attempt to build a great nation. So those are some of the conversations that need to be had now. And these are things that we need to do to inform the electorate. And these are things that we really need to think about carefully before we commit ourselves to certain positions. Can the interests of artisanal miners and big mining companies ever be reconciled? And while I'm at that, can the interests of artisanal miners, and I'm going to get to the subject of conservation later, but can the interests of artisanal miners and conservation, the interests of conservation in this country, can they ever be reconciled? Can you have a situation where artisanal miners actually mine in a way which is environmentally friendly? Can you do that? And that's very necessary, right? It's important for us to actually have that discussion about conservation, because you and I know the importance of conservation to tourism, which again, we look at tourism and we say this has to be one of the drivers of economic development in the country. Not only we're talking about the impact of artisanal mining when it comes to tourism, but there's a lot of disruption that happens as well, even to farming communities and all of that. So can the interests of the artisanal miner and the interests of the farmer and the interests of those reconciled makes it for people? And I'll come back to very shortly, but here's another interest group. Can the interests of the urban elites and the common rural man can know that our concerns and the concerns of the people in the rural areas are not necessarily the same? You know, we are worried about running water. They are worried about whether they can actually have seed to cultivate for the next. Do they have fertilizer and so on? We know that you know, we're not necessarily crying out for the same thing. We want to be able to, you know, get money from the bank so that we can take our families to dinner at a posh restaurant every other weekend or something like that. That's not necessarily what the people in the rural areas are crying out for. And you know what? There can be a solution for us in the cities. It doesn't necessarily mean that that solution is for the 70% of our people who live in the rural areas. So can we reconcile the interests of the urban elites and the interests of the common man? So, you know, we need to have this discussion. And one of the reasons why, for me, this is about a war on poverty, because what a war on poverty should do, in my opinion, is to understand that people in the rural areas must be honored with the same services as people in the cities, when we talk about water reticulation systems and so on. So that's the reason why when you drive in some places in Europe or elsewhere, you find, you know, the water reticulation systems in villages, in the hospitals in villages and stuff like that. And it's critically important for us to understand that we need to honor the majority of our people who live out there in the rural areas with the same services that we provide in rural communities, in urban communities rather. You know, so I'll touch on that again in a little bit, but in the interest of time, fighting historic injustices versus moving forward. That's another conflict. Those are other conflicting interests. You know, how much time and effort and attention do you pay to righting historic injustices as opposed to moving forward? And this is a complicated one because in some ways, our government, the government that has been there, has been so preoccupied with fighting, to right historic injustices, sometimes at the expense of creating a functioning economy for everybody. But at the same time, you can't ignore the pain that people went through, and sometimes, maybe an extreme expression of that might actually be a demand for restitution, but usually the demand for restitution being made, to a post-colonial government, and that sometimes becomes a little bit complex. But there's also a demand for restitution made to the government because of things that it itself did. So how much attention do you pay to that? And how much leadership capital do you expend on fighting or on righting historic injustices versus moving forward? Now, what is unhelpful in our country is this whole idea of being dismissive of people's pain. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and I was saying, you know what, just to let things go, people might smile at you and everything, but at the end of the day, what really determines their attitude towards you is really the pain that they went through, and that's something that needs to be addressed. You've heard me say this consistently, and I will say it again. There are some things that have happened in the history of this country that need to be addressed, and Gugurahundi is one of them. It really needs to be addressed. And a lot of times, the people who try to provide, to lead this conversation are the wrong people. It's really time for us to honor those people who died needlessly in some of these things, by making sure that there are others who can lead this conversation, who make the victims of the things that happened in this country actually feel good about the process. At the same time, we as a country, we have to ask ourselves this question: how much time and capital do we spend on righting historic injustices versus moving forward? I said I was going to talk about conservation in a little bit. So here's the way that I would like to address it. So, poverty creates conflict between the survival interests of rural populations and conservation. So poor people, when they see trees, they are seeing trees as essential fuel. And a lot of times because they don't have any option. Because 38 years after independence, we have not managed to bring the miracle of electric power to rural communities, to the majority of rural communities here. So people still depend on firewood. So when they look at trees, they're seeing essential fuel. And you and I can't blame them. That's the only way they can survive. That's the only way that they can cook. Now, when they look at wild game, for instance, wild animals, well, some of them are looking at wild animals as a source of food. And also they're looking at wild animals as a threat to their crops and to their lives. So how do you reconcile the need for conservation and, the need for people in the rural areas to survive? And one of the things that is very, very important for us to look at is, so people talk about tourism, for instance, and just how much it can actually add to the national fiscus, and I agree. And if you have read our 10-point plan, if you've read our manifesto, you will hear, we've talked about that, the need for us to really work on the tourism master plan and all of that. Okay, that's wonderful, but let's look at the other side. Who really benefits from tourism? So, you could say the national economy, then you'd be right. If tourism is actually bringing in money into the national fiscus, well, it benefits the national economy. And how then is the national, the fiscus divided? Is it something that primarily benefits the 70% of our people who are living in abject poverty? What is it that we need to do to make sure that the conservation and tourism really benefits the rural poor? You know what? I've had conversations with people, some who have come in from the United States and other places, and they're trying to tell me, you know what, it was wonderful. We went to this rural community, then we hunted for elephants, and after killing the elephants, we donated the meat to villagers, and all the villagers were very happy, and all of that. And to be honest with you, sometimes I find that really insulting. Because these people that you have donated money from shooting an elephant and all that, after you leave, they are still living in abject poverty. They still don't have hospitals, they still don't have proper classrooms and stuff like that. And these are things that we must face. And I'm not against people coming in to Zimbabwe to hunt, but it's very, very important for us to ask ourselves these questions. Do the people who really are poor in this country, how much do they benefit from some of these things? And, unless we address that, there's always going to be this conflict between the survival interests of the poor and the interests of conservation. Now, the poor need to survive. We need conservation. We need to make sure that we can bequeath to the next generation, an environment that is sustainable. And we know what it will be sad for us to see all these beautiful animals becoming extinct. So, absolutely these things need to be controlled. But you and I also know one of the unspoken about things is the involvement of government elites in even the chain that contributes towards poaching and all of that. We know that, and this is something that is really very important for us to address. Some of the things that go on in some of these areas which are blamed on poor people, there are people with vested interests that facilitate that. So, we need to really have a very, very serious discussion about all these things. Now, here's another thing, and as I said, I'm really concerned that we might not be able, to, get to too many questions because of the internet. So I'm going to go through the next two questions, the next two issues really fast, and then address some of your questions. The urban poor cultivating in open fields, which lead to clogging of drainage systems, is really a matter of survival for many of them. They're not doing so because they just want to do so. They want to supplement their meager incomes, with their, by cultivating these fields and having food, having corn and all of that, But how do you reconcile the survival needs of the urban poor with the need for, a proper organization in the urban communities and the protection of water reticulation and drainage systems and all of that? How do you do that? Now, again, the standard answer for all of us is like, create more employment, and then make sure that these people are well paid so that they don't have to do that. Absolutely. That's the objective, I'm sure for every leader. Every well-meaning leader comes in there and says, I'll create more employment so that this can happen. Now, what you are going to find is that this can be a persistent problem unless you actually address the issues of the people at the bottom. This can be a persistent problem. And you know what? I remember the times when the city council would send out their workers and they would actually cut the corn from these areas. Isn't it interesting? If you drive today on Borodale Road, right there at the intersection of Harare Drive and Domboshawa Road, as you're going toward Domboshawa and you look on the right, there's a field. And it's an open secret that field belongs to the former First family. And they're plowing there, right there. And, here's what happens, obviously, to people. Okay, if you guys can do it, we can do it. Why shouldn't we do it? And now, you do it in a more organized way. But what about me? I mean, what do? I need to feed my family. The issues of inequality, if they are not dealt with properly, make it difficult for us to come up with a united stand on what is good for all of us. Okay, let me just address one more thing. Today I got something from somebody who I really respect, who is an expert on roads and all that. And he said something which I hadn't really thought about, I must admit, but made so much sense. And they said, okay, you look at the whole idea of dualization. And we Zimbabweans, we jump up and down when such programs are announced. We are going to dualize this road and all that. And this gentleman said, you must ask, who is calling for this dualization? Because it's some of these big infrastructure projects that enrich a few people. And sometimes some of these huge infrastructure projects, which are made a priority, should actually take second place to the need to develop roads that actually integrate the rural economy with the urban economy. Now, we need good roads. There's no doubt about it. We need a good highway system and all of that. But the issue is capacity driving the need for dualization, or there's somebody who is going to make an incredible amount of money from that process, which is which? And what should be a priority? Should the priority not be ways of integrating the rural economy with the rest of the economy by making sure that the roads going into every part of this country are well serviced? Now, I must admit, I actually hadn't thought about that. And I said, this is food for thought, because we get excited a lot of times by some of these big projects. But then here's what happens. If you actually then really focus on making sure that you integrate the rural economy with the rest of the economy, then capacity then demands that you dualize your roles and you do all these other things. But a lot of times our reasoning is backward. And a lot of times the reason why the reasoning is backward is because somebody really, really benefits from that backward thinking. And a couple of issues that have actually been trending this week, which I really find to be unfortunate. I'm sure you've watched the whole issue with the hit streak and the cricket board and all that. Now, look, I'm not very well versed on issues relating to cricket, but I just want to point out that unfortunately in this country, it's very easy for us to just raise the race card every time something happens, and I think it's a tragedy for our country, and it really speaks to why we really need to talk to each other. Before, there's nothing as hurtful as saying to somebody who may actually not have a racist bone in their system, no, you're a racist. I think it's important for us to relate to each other as Zimbabweans and really look at the facts. And until we are able to do that, we are really not going to be able to build the great country that we need to build. So let me at this point address some of your questions. And as I said, I'm really worried about excuse me just a minute, let me make sure that we can actually do that, because 1 second, I am going to be back in 1 minute. I'm just trying to make sure that we are still on. All right. Okay, I don't know if that's going to help us much, but anyway, let me try to get to some of the questions that have been forwarded here. Okay, what is the social return on investment deals being signed? What models will you apply? What do you understand by applying a social return on investment criteria for foreign investments? Well, that's a great question, and it's not just a question of social return. It's a return. Even what is the benefit accruing to our people? And this is where this is very concerning. We've always had governments that simply make decisions for us. We don't have a free marketplace of ideas in the country where these ideas then make their way into informing how decisions are made. We don't. We have we've had closed systems in this country for the past 38 years. I mean, you try to advise. You and I know many people who are in very, very significant positions in global economies who have tried to actually advise this government. And unless you actually came in and you were a member of ZANU-PF, you would not be listened to. I am worried about any deals that are signed at a time when we have not really changed the culture of government, at a time when, in fact, we have lost so much, even in terms of knowing how to deal with others in the global economy. We've lost so much because people have left, and they don't even want to waste their time really advising the government, or if they do, they may be very self-interested. There are people who actually want to ingratiate themselves with the people who are in authority so that they can get some favors. So, I worry about whether our government ever really gets the right kind of counsel from people. And you and I know, this is a transitional government. President Mnangagwa, according to our constitution, is serving out the remainder of Mugabe's term. That's what's happening. And in other countries, when you get to a time such as this close to elections, there are certain things that governments don't do because, just out of fairness, so that they don't obligate governments that are coming to some things that they shouldn't. What I worry about is that this is all part of campaigning now. So the hope, in my view, is that something is going to come out of these deals that turns things around quickly, and then that becomes a campaigning platform for a government which is really serving out the term of Robert Mugabe, and that's tragic for us. So whether you're talking about a social return, whether you're talking about actual monetary return, the actual benefit to the Zimbabwean people, that concerns me. I don't see it, and I'm very, very worried about that going forward. And it is my hope that some of these things actually stop happening. There are a lot of people who get excited about governments signing deals. And, I don't know, I said this last week, if we don't learn from history, we do so at our own peril. So the deals that were signed by successive ZANU-PF regimes in the past 38 years did not build a robust economy for us. That's not how you build a robust economy. There are some fundamental things that you address within. So you address the rule of law, you address the whole issue of competent leadership who can manage your monetary affairs. You address the issue of property rights. Those are fundamental things that you address first. You don't just go around signing deals. And some of these things, the word deal is a misnomer because it implies that, we've gotten something that is really for our good, kind of like at the expense of the other party that signed. Look, the Chinese are not stupid. The Chinese deal with the best kinds of governments. Why is it that Donald Trump right now is crying and saying, you know what, there is an incredible trade deficit between them and China, and trying to bring about, to impose these tariffs? They are really good at this. The Chinese are really good at this. They're not stupid. They're not idiots by any means. And they know what they're doing when they sign those deals. They know they're going to be, and a lot of this, you have to pay the money anyway. These things are not free. I mean, this has to get through to our minds as Africans. These are debts that we're committing ourselves to. And they come and they build these things. They bring their labor. They bring their wheelbarrows and horse pipes and everything to some of these deals and so on. It really doesn't, there's not much employment that is created for your people, So it's to actually not worry about this concerns me as a citizen. Okay, let me go to the next question here. Let's see. Is your party going for all the 200 seats, 10 seats, or just the presidential candidacy? Well, you know what? We are absolutely mobilizing in every part of this country. And what we'll see as we get closer to the election, how far we've gone. But we are mobilizing everywhere we can, and with the idea that we should, go for the 210 seats. But that actually gives me an opportunity to talk about something that may surprise some of you. I am absolutely committed to the kind of governance in our country where the executive is really held accountable by the legislature. So, in some places, they call this a divided government, not in a negative sense. Divided government is a government where one party wins the presidency and another wins the legislature. And the good thing about that is that then the executive doesn't just make decisions without persuading the legislature and making sure that they buy in. It works in some countries, So to me, I really don't think that a party winning the presidency, but not necessarily having a parliamentary majority, is a bad thing, because what we have had in the past 38 years is a government that has won in inverted commas, the presidency, and there's a parliamentary majority and will not listen to anybody. And the people in parliament just rubber stamps everything that the executive suggests, and that is tragic for our country. There's another question here. With a high tobacco farming industry, why are we not exporting cigarettes? Why do we keep selling low-cost produce but using vast amounts of land to produce products for other people to make money out of our land? And you and I know also the tobacco industry globally. I lived in North Carolina, which is one of the highest tobacco producing states in the United States. And I saw during the time that I lived there the drastic changes in the tobacco industry. It's not an easy subject. There's right now a very big and growing industry for vapors instead of actual tobacco, electronic cigarettes, and things like that. And there has been an impact on the global tobacco industry from the concerns about health and things like that. And you know what? We as Zimbabwe will be impacted by it.